Welcome to Senior Moments. Here we are at the Senior Center here on Berry Street in Montpelier. And Aura Paul and I are doing Eric Nielsen again for next 10 shows like that on his favorite Bach. And this is the first one, and we're looking very forward to all of the interesting things he's going to be talking about today.
Very often, when people compile lists of the world's great composers, which I find a colossal waste of time personally, but when they do, the name that most often comes up at the top of the list is that of Johann Sebastian Bach. And I want to ask you why you think that is. You've all signed up for this class, so why do you think he ends up at the top of the list so often? And it's not all the same list by the same person, by the way. Why do you think? And I am asking, this is not a rhetorical question.
I think it's probably because he was the earliest. He's at the top of the list because he was the earliest of the ones that are usually on the list. And so people, all right, I'll go in order. And
Oh, okay. Chronological superiority. The older the better. Okay.
Well, what about alphabetical?
Well, that's true too. He comes before Beethoven and Brahms, and also before Bartok. So yeah, I can't think of too many A's there. So anyway,
He's the best
okay. Why?
because this man was incredible. He and Mozart together both did innumerable compositions, usually in very short periods of time, and they managed to do that while doing other things. In Bach's situation, he was the primary organist at several major churches. He, directed the choir, whatever. I mean, he did it all.
And had 20 children along with
And
his
he had
two wives. Yes.
But he took the Baroque style to somehow or they made something that was really pretty, I don't know quite, mechanical in a way. This is my personal one, okay?
That's what I was asking for.
And he made it special. How he did that, I don't know, but he did. It was all very creative within a very rigid musical style. And that's why I think he's the best.
Okay.
Well, I
Diana?
was going to say something similar in that I'm here to find out, really, if it's true that he, made innovations, just as Jane was saying, that moved that kind of music, or music in general, along, moved it, pushed it forward in some ways, and I was hoping that's what I've discovered from taking this class.
Well, you might get done and find you've discovered some other things that say something different, but that's okay. Bernice.
He was the first to develop or create the contrapuntal style, and every other composer from then on built on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Martha.
I think of the complexity of his music. That's what I love the most. But also the intensity and how it reaches out to people.
Liz.
It's something about the structure of his music. You really feel as though it's creative and it has wonderful tunes, and other composers do that. But there's something about the structure and the way it's built that just makes it so much more powerful.
This is a combination of intellectual and emotional.
Yeah.
Leanne and I, neither of us read music, and I'm here at least partly to find out more of that, the intellectual part, but the emotional part has certainly always touched me.
Yeah, Richard.
I look at it as almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in the fact that so many people like him, so many people play him, so therefore people like myself probably know more of his stuff than we would a lot of other composers because of exposure and the popularity for the reasons that you outlined.
And sometimes he just rocks.
That's unanswerable. Bach rocks. There we go. We'll have T-shirts printed, right?
No, it's almost that sometimes there's this unbelievable drive to do it.
Oh, there is.
That's what I meant by right. Rock and roll.
That is a characteristic of the era, but it's certainly a characteristic of his music. Liz.
Unbelievable what?
It drives. There's a drive to some of his music, and that's. I mean, it's not in all parts of his music, but sometimes I'm struck by how, wow, this sounds so. You want to dance to it in a way.
And you can dance.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that I think has made him so attractive to jazz composers and performers is the combination of rhythmic drive and very strong harmonic feel underneath, so that it's something that translates quite easily into jazz, and that is actually true of the entire Baroque era because of what they did with their bass line, and jazz is very, very much bass line oriented. For me, and I will confess right off the bat that Bach is not my favorite composer. But some of my favorite works are by Bach. I would be hard-pressed to name a favorite composer, although if I had to be, I will admit that if I had to be stuck on a desert island with only one, it would be Beethoven. But for me, the reason I think that many people are so taken with Bach is because of the spiritual depth of his music. And this is true whether it's a cantata or a solo suite for cello, whether it's a Brandenburg concerto or the B minor mass. It does not have to be overtly religious for it to have great spiritual content. And he is supposed to have written on all of his scores the phrase Soli Deo Gloria, only to the glory of God. And so for him, this was a spiritual practice. So I think that it's important to keep that in mind as we work. At the same time, I think it is also important not to mythologize any composer, not even me. Because we can get the idea that people who wrote these great sacred works, notably Bach and Handel, for instance, were somehow saintly. Handel is supposed to have taken a soprano and held her out of a third-story window and threatened to drop her if she didn't sing in tune.
That's all right.
Having felt that way about singers sometimes, I know the idea, but I would not want that put into practice. Bach got in fist fights. He got in all sorts of trouble with his employers every single position that he held. And it wasn't just because he was ornery like Beethoven, it was because he had such high standards and he felt that they were not being followed and that he was not getting backup by the employers. So it's important to recognize that this is somebody who switched jobs a lot, who sometimes let some of his other duties slide, but we're here for his music. Come back. Come back. Yeah, it'll be back. Yeah.
Is that white noise coming from the kitchen? And if
It is.
If I close the,
Sure.
the thing?
If you'd like to.
Yeah.
There we go. One of the difficulties of working with Bach is that his works you will often see numbers, as you will with Beethoven, Opus 125, for instance, or something like that. There's also, yeah, I think it's the air circulation system, actually.
That's better.
That is better, okay. Great, thank you. With Bach, the numbers are not chronological. They were organized in the 1950s into what's called the Bach Works Catalog, BWV in German as an abbreviation. And they are organized according to type. So the first 200 and something are all cantatas. and his instrumental works tend to be down in the 1,000 range. So luckily for me, I found a website that gives his works year by year. But there is a difficulty with Bach that some other composers later don't have, and this is a difficulty also of other Baroque composers, and that is namely that there's a lot of mystery about the works. They're not as well documented as with Beethoven or, for instance, especially in later composers like Brahms. And also an additional difficulty that Bach reworked a lot of his pieces as in the 1720s and 30s, depending on different circumstances that he found himself in, because he was in different church jobs or different ducal positions in which he had different forces available to him. So he would rework his pieces, and sometimes he would take melodies from his secular pieces and put new sacred words to them. This idea of recycling material is a very, very old one, and Baroque composers did it all the time. Once we get beyond the Baroque, it doesn't happen quite so often, except with Rossini, and there it was because he was lazy and always had deadlines. And so he would take an overture from one opera and plop it into another one. But with Bach, you see it quite often. He would just reuse things. Handel did it also. So we'll sort of go chronologically, but not necessarily completely. Johann Sebastian Bach was born in the town of Eisenach on March 21st or March 31st, 1685. Now, we always celebrate his birthday on the 21st. That is the old calendar designation. The new calendar designation is the 31st. I wish we would switch it to the 31st because Modest Mussorgsky's birthday is also on the 21st. And I would like him to get some due. Nobody remembers his birthday. Everybody's so busy doing Bach. Anyway, he was the 8th and youngest child of Johann Ambrosius Bach, who was the director of town musicians in Eisenach, and Maria Elisabeth Lemmerhirt. His father probably taught him violin and keyboard. He came from a family of musicians. His grandparents, his great-grandparents, a lot of his uncles, they were all professional musicians. So in that area of Germany, if you said Bach, it meant musician. His brothers were musicians, and it's a good thing, because he was orphaned by the time he was 10. And he went to live with his eldest brother, Johann Christoph Bach, who was an organist and composer. And he followed up on the theoretical work and the violin work that their father had begun, and helped him learn how to play keyboard instruments. Our hero also used the opportunity to take scores and copy them, because that's how he learned about composing, about structure, was through writing these things down. His brother forbade him to do that for practical reasons. Score paper was very expensive, and scores were uncommon, and they were very valuable. So there's a story that Bach actually would go upstairs or downstairs, wherever the cabinet was where the scores were, when nobody was awake, and he would go in with a slip of paper and slide it in and get the music and slide it out, and then take it and copy it, and then slide it back in. After years of copying music himself, as well as having people help him copy, he went blind at the end of his life, as did Handel, helped along, no doubt, by both of their being operated on by the same surgeon. At 15, and he had already learned, by the time he was an early teen, he'd been exposed to music by not just German composers like Pachelbel and Froberger, but also French school composers like Jean-Baptiste Lully. And at 15, he went with a friend to a very prestigious school, a couple of hundred miles away. They walked to get there, St. Michael's School in Lüneburg. He got to play organ and harpsichord there, and by the time he graduated in 1703, when he was about 18, he became organist first at Weimar, then he switched over to Arnstadt, and then again to Mühlhausen. These are all towns in central Germany. And in Mühlhausen, he began having his first tensions with his employers. So it started early, by the time he was about 20. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on Reformation music and the sacred tradition that Bach inherited, because I think it's important. When Luther began the Reformation, now there were several paths to the Reformation depending on where you were. There was Calvin in Switzerland and other people in France, and Henry VIII in England, which is basically because he wanted a divorce and the Pope wouldn't give him one. But Luther in Germany was the primary mover in that area. Now you have to remember, Germany as a nation did not exist. It was part of the Holy Roman Empire, which presupposed being Catholic or members of the Western Church, because that's all there was at the time in Western Europe. The early Lutheran services followed very closely the structure of Latin and Catholic Church services. So a lot of the text was in Latin, a lot of the music was Gregorian chant. Gradually, this was replaced by text and sermon in the vernacular in German, and also hymns. Now, the term we use for Lutheran hymns is chorales. It just means hymns. And in the early days, they could come from any place. The text could be sacred. It could be something that was taken right out of the Old or New Testament, or it could be something that was newly created. And Luther created a large number of very well-known texts, such as "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," and others. The tunes, Luther gets credit for a lot of them. My suspicion is that his colleague Johann Walter actually wrote most of the music that was newly created. But music could also be folk music that was just grabbed and put in place. Luther is supposed to have said, "Why should the devil get all the good tunes?" So he didn't care where it came from as long as it was good. One of the innovations that Walter had was to take the hymn tune, the original tune, in multi-part music, that is, for instance, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. In Catholic music, music from Italy, primarily, in the early Baroque era, by composers like Monteverdi, you had this hymn tune, so-called cantus firmus, the strong song, as it were, the original tune around which everything else was built. It was often in the tenor voice. And curiously, that translated on this side of the pond to where the original tune was in shape note music in the 18th century in New England. So that's a weird coincidence, or not. But what Walter did was he put the cantus firmus up in the highest voice, where it could be heard best. And that's where it stayed. So in Bach's chorales, that's where you almost always hear the tune in a chorus. And I'll demonstrate that in a little bit. The use of chorales, that is, these songs that were multi-part, was pretty well established by the time Bach became an adult. However, what was transitioning was where the texts were coming from. In cantatas. Now that's another C word. It's an Italian word, and it just means sing together. And there were two formats in Italy: sonata, for instrumentalists, play together; cantata, sing together. And they both had two usages, sacred and secular. And they had different formats depending on whether it was sacred or secular. In Italy, the home of opera, a lot of the mannerisms and the forms from opera were just taken and used in secular and sacred cantatas, so much so that by the death of the greatest Italian cantata writer, who was Alessandro Scarlatti in 1725, the form had pretty much died out and secular cantatas just became operas. In Germany, what happened was there were a lot of Italian composers in courts and Italian trained composers. So they followed a lot of those trends, but using German texts. And what happened was there was a whole range of new text writers, poets, who made these poetical texts that were much more sentimental than the earlier ones. Now, Bach, in a lot of ways, was a conservative composer. He preferred the old texts. Not exclusively. He used some of the newer ones, but he used a lot of the older ones, and I think it was because they appealed to his spirituality more, and he didn't want to be stuck in ones that were inferior. A lot of these sentimental texts were quite inferior, and it marks in some ways the difference between some of his works in his middle period and some of his later ones, where he uses some of the old texts or ones from text writers who are steeped in that tradition and wrote stronger. Well, if it were operas he was writing, I would call them libretti, but they're texts for his cantatas and also for his passions. So he used these old ones much more than his contemporaries, Telemann and Graupner, who wrote many, many more cantatas than Bach. They just dashed them off all the time. He took much more care. But when he came to apply for the job of cantor at St. Thomas in Leipzig, which became his most famous post, he was actually the third choice. And the reason for that is they wanted Telemann because he had a much larger track record of writing cantatas. Well, he turned them down, so they turned to Graupner, and he turned them down. But they both had much more of a track record, and one of the counselors is supposed to have said, well, I suppose if we can't get the best, we'll have to go for second best. So the joke was on them. But in any case, when it came time to make a cantata, Bach and other composers, but particularly Bach, because he's the subject of our talking, structured it, unless it was a solo cantata. Some of his cantatas are just for a single voice. But if it was a multi-voice cantata, it was usually that he took, say, Luther's chorale with, let's say, 6 voices. And the first 6 verses, rather, excuse me. The first verse would be for chorus. There might be an overture or a symphonia ahead of it where the instruments just played. And in this chorus, there would be the slow version of the hymn tune, the chorale tune, in the soprano, and it would be surrounded by ornamented instrumentation and also ornamented other voice parts. Verse 2 might be a recitative for soprano followed by an aria. Now this is something borrowed from operatic structure. Okay, a da capo aria where you do the whole A section, then the B section, then you go back to the beginning. Only in his cantatas, often it wasn't the voice, it would just be the instrumental beginning of the A that would be repeated. Then there might be a chorus, then there might be a bass solo, then there might be a tenor and alto duet, and at the very end would come the chorale in a very simple hymn-like setting, and that was because these were performed at church. And so this was the opportunity for the congregation to join in. You have to remember, church services were 4 hours long. And when Bach was writing for St. Thomas Kirche, the service began at 7 o'clock. His job was to make sure that all the music was done by 8, because then came the sermon, which lasted an hour. And then they would have the offering and communion, and that would often go on because they'd have hundreds of people in the church and they would all come forward. So there was music then too, but that would often go on for an hour and a half. And then they would finish off. Then Bach and his musicians would go to the sister church and do the same material, except in a shortened form, for evensong. So Sunday was a busy day for the musicians. All right, so the first piece of music that we're going to listen to is one of his early cantatas that was written probably around 1707 or 1708 when he was in Weimar. And it is an Easter cantata, Christ lag in Todesbanden. Christ lay in the bonds of death. And it's instructive to look at the tune and where it comes from. Originally, there is a chant. And the Latin chant, and it's an Easter song, Christ ist erstanden, and it's da 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 dum, da 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 dum, da 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 dum, da Luther, or probably Walter, took that and modified it a little bit. Da, 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 da. So he's added an extra note coming down the scale. Da, 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 da. And that would be repeated. And then da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. Now, the first thing that Bach does when he gets a hold of this, and you'll hear this, is instead of going da, 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 he goes da, da, da. So he changes it from a whole step to a half step, and that's so it will fit in with the harmony. Okay? So the first thing we're going to listen to is a fantasia on this tune, because Bach used these chorale tunes. He was steeped in these tunes from his childhood. So he used the material, and like anything that we're really familiar with, we feel free to do a lot of things with it. So he would write fantasias, he would write chorale preludes where you can hear sort of the tune, but you have to be listening really carefully. And this is being played by the French organist Paul Denet. So here it is. And there it is. But you can hear it's ornamented. Repeats the tune with the same voicing in the organ this time. Now, Bach didn't write the voicings out, say, you know, trumpet here, flute here. It's up to the organist. This is the third phrase of the chorale now. Phrase now. And interestingly, he ends with just a bare octave. So although the piece has been basically in minor, instead of going to what's called a Picardy third, where he turns it into major at the end, which was certainly a convention of the era, he makes it a very bare octave. You will have noted, I'm sure, all the imitation that's going on. One voice coming in, then another voice coming in to imitate it. This is imitative counterpoint, and it finds its greatest expression in a very strict form called the fugue, and I will play you a fugue in a few minutes. But before we do, we're going to actually listen to the entire cantata Christ lag in Todesbanden. And this is a really, really nice performance by the Ensemble Orlando from Fribourg, which is in Switzerland. And these days, you would be laughed out of town if you did a 1940s or 50s style huge orchestra, huge chorus version. So you'll see it's a small chorus. You'll also notice that the altos are mixed, that is, they're male countertenors as well as female altos. And there are three fine soloists and really interesting instrumentation. I want you to take special note of the bass. And this is an early cantata for very small forces, so it's quite conservative in style, and also there are no wind instruments, whatever, there's no timpani, so it's just strings and a small portative organ which plays continuo. Now continuo is the bass line. That's what the composer usually played to keep everybody together, and all that was written out was the bass line with a group of little Arabic numerals underneath that delineated the interval above the bass note that was to be played to show what the chord was. And all these people were very skilled at this. Not only that, but they probably wrote the piece, so they knew what the harmony was, and they filled it in from there. So you can see the parallels with jazz. I can see that fantasia being moved up in tempo and done in swing. No, I really can. I can hear that, and it would work completely. So that's why Bach is a really favorite composer of a lot of jazz musicians. Anyway, here it is, cantata BWV 4, which tells you it is an early cantata, although those numbers are misleading, so you can't be too literal about that. Here it is. And the conductor's wonderful. He smiles a lot. This starts with a sinfonia, like in an overture. Violinist playing with very little vibrato. See the frets? That's a 5-string violone, an ancient instrument. Listen to the sopranos. They've got the tune. Very long notes. Basses have a version of the tune. That tune is every place. It just saturates the texture. Don't you love it when the group has this much fun? So that was verse 1. This will be verse 2. No man could conquer death among all mortal children. Our sin has caused all this. No innocence was to be found. Hence came death so suddenly and took power over us, kept us imprisoned in his realm. Hallelujah. That was what we just heard. Fabulous. That dramatic pause was, hence nothing remains but death's image. Death has lost its sting. Next comes a bass solo. Here is the true Easter lamb that God has offered us, which high on the tree of the cross is roasted in burning love. Its blood marks our door. Faith holds this up to death. The strangler can no longer harm us. a tenor, I have envy of those low notes. Now, Bach was 22 when he wrote that, which is very discouraging for some of us older composers who haven't quite managed his level of skill. But anyway, be that as it may, the interesting thing is, at least according to one source, the chorale written for the end, the original chorale was replaced when he got to Leipzig with the present one that's being done, which is a little bit more elaborate. So it's, again, an example of how he reworked things. But the rest of it was quite early. It was done in Mühlhausen. And this was a terrific performance, I thought. And interesting to note that the female cellist was playing a 5-string cello, which is highly unusual. And you can notice some other things about performance practice. When one of the violists was resting in a movement where the full orchestra was not in use, you could see the bow sticking up, and it's one of these very, very thin Baroque bows that allows a lot more flexibility than a later heavier bow, and it allows a lightness to the sound that you get in this. And having that lightness means that you can have a chorus that's this size. And what you lose in mass, you gain tremendously in flexibility. which particularly in the fast movements is really needed. So I mentioned fugue. Fugue is a very strict form. It grew out of contrapuntal imitation. Now, counterpoint just means voice against voice. And you can have non-imitative counterpoint, where there are two voices doing completely different things but are working against or with each other. But imitative counterpoint was very common from the mid to late 16th century onward, and it became highly sophisticated. And by the late 17th century, this new form of the fugue had come into being. It was much more formalized than the earlier 16th century canonic imitation, because the piece was organized according to the principles of having strict use of the theme called the subject. One voice enters, then when a second voice enters, this is not like a canon where the first voice goes back to the beginning again. It goes on and does some other material. So depending on how many voices you have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or even 6 parts. When that comes to its conclusion, that's the end of what's called the entrance section. Then there's a freer section called an episode, where material from the subject is used fairly freely. And these alternate, these sections, and then you get to an end which is often climactic by using what is called stretto, where instead of waiting for the whole phrase before the next voice comes in, the next voice follows close upon the heels of the first one, and so on, and it heightens the intensity. So at about the same time that Bach was writing the cantata that we just heard and also the chorale prelude, in 1707 he wrote one of his most famous fugues called the Little Fugue in G minor, and I'm going to play it on a period instrument. This is a tracker organ, that is, it's not a modern organ. You have to pull the stops out, and it's wind powered rather than electronically powered, and it's played by the Baroque specialist Ton Koopman from the Netherlands. So here's the Little Fugue in G minor. You may recognize the theme. It's certainly very well known. Third entrance. Final entrance. This is an episode. then the organist gets a workout. The number of voices in the initial section, the number of entrances determines what the numerical part is. When we talk about it as a 3-part fugue or a 4-part fugue, it's not how many sections there are, it's how many distinct voices there are. And it's completely contrapuntal, and yet it still has to make sense vertically as chords. So it's tremendously difficult in terms of skill level. It's said that when Beethoven was working on a 6-voice fugue for his Missa Solemnis, he walked about looking like a man distracted to the point of insanity. Now, that wasn't all that unusual for Beethoven, but it was especially so when he was working on this. Now, yes, Liz?
A technical organ question?
Yes?
He was playing on the middle keyboard,
Yes.
but the keys above were moving.
Yes.
What was that?
That was using what's called a coupler, where it couples two manuals together so that it doubles the sound. And sometimes the upper one is an octave higher. There are all sorts of variations that can go on, but it's used for a very specific reason, usually. And so that's what was going on there. You sometimes see it on harpsichords also that have 2 manuals. You'll be playing the bottom manual, and with the coupler, that adds a lot of volume because then you get them both playing. You're welcome. By 1708, which is the year after he wrote the cantata we just heard and this, he was back in Weimar, where he took a position in the Duke's court. And what that meant was much less sacred music, much more instrumental music and secular music. He wrote most of his organ works during the 10 years he was in Weimar. He also wrote cantatas, but they tended to be secular ones. And certainly one of the silliest, as far as unintentionally so, in terms of the text, is his so-called hunting cantata, BWV 208, which was written in typical fashion of the time to celebrate the birthday of a friend of the Duke, Prince Christian von Sachsen-Weisenfels, who apparently enjoyed hunting. So this is all about the joys of the hunt expressed in terms of ancient Roman mythology. And so Diana shows up, and Endymion shows up, and Diana again, and Pan shows up, and most of this is eminently forgettable in terms of the text, but the most famous part of it is the chorus, "Sheep May Safely Graze," which comes from this, and it's, you'll hear it. Often it's done chorally, but originally it is a soprano solo. "Sheep may ever graze securely where a worthy shepherd wakes." This is, of course, buttering up the prince, talking about somebody being, you know, a just ruler. Apparently he was a spendthrift and bankrupted his kingdom, but that's beside the point. "Where the rulers well are ruling, may one rest and peace discover, and what nations blissful makes." And I do have to point out that this translation is by Philip Ambrose of UVM. So. All right, so here we are, and unfortunately, we just get to watch the cover rather than a set of performers performing. So we're going to pick this up. This was done a number of years ago by the, come on, Eric. The Concentus Musicus Vienna with Nicholas Arnoncourt directing. So we're going to pick it up right here to recitative. This is Diana saying, you know, I love you, Endymion, but I got to get out and hunt. let me at least go with you. Yes, yes, we'll bring our flames of fervor with glad good wishes now together. And then in comes Pan, who says basically, you know, I'm a god, but I'm going to yield the field to Prince Christian. For this illustrious Pan his land so happy maketh, that wood and field and all are live with laughter. So he's comparing the prince to himself, but saying he's even better than I am. also giving her honor to Prince Christian. Back to the beginning. This is a da capo aria, da capo, back to the head, to the beginning. So the first section, then a middle section, which we just heard, and then it goes back to the beginning. Then join the song. and to this day's delight perfection bring. And there's that contrapuntal complexity that so many of you mentioned at the beginning of the class with the horns and the strings. He was 28 when he wrote that, and you can hear by the, these are valveless horns, and they have a much brassier sound than modern horns. So it was a much louder sort of thing. They were kind of imitating, they were much closer to their earlier cousins, the hunting horn, than to the modern horn. And it took a great deal of skill to play scales because they only used the natural overtone series. Same thing with trumpet players. That's why Bach's trumpet parts are so very high. It's the only place you could play scales. So that is all the time we have for today. Liz, you had your hand up?
Yeah, the choral fugues
Yes.
that you wrote, did they mostly enter as soprano, alto, tenor, bass?
Not always. Not always. It varied. It varied. So yeah, extremely silly text, but really terrifically written music.
Who would hear that? Would that just be the people in the court?
Yes. This was basically private performances.
Yeah.
I mean, there were no concert halls in those days. It was either done in a salon, instrumental music, or it was done in a chapel, or it was done for a service in a church, or it was done in a hall for royalty or nobility.
Yeah.
Those were the choices. Concert halls weren't built until the 19th century. Bernice.
The three pieces on here that you didn't play play? Is there something special or something for you?
Yes, toccata and fugue in D Dorian. Toccata is a freer form than a fugue, so he would often, it's an older form, goes back to the late Renaissance, and it just means playing around basically with an idea. And then it's followed by a very strict format, the fugue. The prelude and partita owes a great deal to the French clavecinists, people like Rameau and Couperin. It's a very French-sounding piece if you know any of their music. So that's good to listen to because it shows the influence on Bach of that music as well as Italian music. The trio is extremely short. It's about 1.5 minutes, and it uses the same tune, one of the tunes that's used in the later cantata. So that's why I included that. Next week, we'll continue in Weimar and we'll get into more instrumental music.